Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 27th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. We've received apologies this morning from Joe Fitzpatrick, so I'm pleased that we're joined by Keith Brown this morning. And agenda item 1 is for the committee to decide whether or not this morning to take agenda items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. And agenda item 2 is consideration of a Section 22 report from the Auditor General on the 2023-24 audit of UHI Perth. So can I welcome our witnesses this morning? We're joined by the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle. Good morning, Auditor General. And alongside Mr Boyle is Mark McPherson, who is an Audit Director at Audit Scotland. And I'm very pleased as well to welcome Nicola Wright, who's an engagement lead for Deloitte, who carried out the audit of Perth College on behalf of Audit Scotland. We've got quite a number of questions to put to you this morning on this report. But before we get to those questions, Auditor General, could I invite you to make an opening statement?
Many thanks indeed, Convener, and good morning to the committee. And Convener, I am presenting the report this morning on the 2023-24 audit of UHI Perth under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act 2000. My report focuses on the failure of UHI Perth to agree a budget for the financial year 2023-24 and a lack of a clear recorded decision on why there was an absence of a budget. Reporting to college management on college finances was therefore limited by the absence of this annual budget. Convener, this raises significant concerns about the financial controls and governance arrangements at UHI Perth at that time. Budgets help inform decision-making and contribute to the efficient use of public resources. The absence of a budget was limited regular reporting to college management on finances meant that there was no clear mechanism for identifying and remedying emerging financial issues or for holding college management to account for any variances. UHI Perth recorded a deficit annual operating position of £2 million in 2023-24 and has since made 2 requests for additional liquidity support to UHI and the Scottish Funding Council. The college is currently experiencing significant financial challenges. We note, not directly, Convener, that the absence of a budget is the reason for the deficit, but we can't help but conclude that there must have been a significant factor that the absence of a budget meant that the Board of Management was less able to control financial arrangements during this time. As ever, Convener, I hope that our reports are a useful tool, not just for this college, but for all colleges, in the importance of strong financial management and governance arrangements at a time of financial challenges in this sector. In 2024-25, UHI Perth has reinstated the budget setting process. We've seen that it is taking steps to address the weaknesses in its financial controls and governance arrangements, and it is finalising a financial recovery plan with the support of the Scottish Funding Council and UHI, the regional strategic body for UHI Perth. The internal auditor of UHI Perth is reviewing the college's budget and financial controls, and these are welcome developments, and we'll continue to monitor their impact and implementation during future audits. Lastly, Convener, my report has also highlighted that several issues occurred at UHI Perth since the end of the 2023-24 financial year. And these have included the administration of UHI Perth's subsidiary company, errors in the 24-25 budget, and significant turnover within the senior management and the Board of Management. These events occurred after the end of the financial year to which my report relates, and so they're therefore not subject to detailed audit work. You can be assured, Convener and the committee, that Nicola Wright and her colleagues at Deloitte will consider these matters in detail during the 24-25 audit of UHI Perth. As ever, Convener, myself, Nicola and Mark will do our utmost to answer the committee's questions on this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just take you back to your second last point, which is about the role of UHI, which is the regional strategic body with some kind of oversight of Perth College, and also the Scottish Funding Council. I mean, what part do they play in oversight and governance of a college like this?
So you're right. These are both very significant stakeholders of UHI Perth. And maybe actually, I'm sure Nicola and Mark will both want to comment. Mark, maybe particularly on the role that the Funding Council plays with colleges. And Nicola, perhaps from her experience of auditing the college, can say more about what role the regional strategic body plays. But they're absolutely clear and have a direct stake in the running of this college convener. And I think, in general terms, UHI is the regional strategic body, and that affords them really responsibility for the strategic oversight and funding arrangements of Perth, of UHI Perth. It doesn't absolve the Board of Management for responsibility for the delivery of strategy and financial management arrangements. So there are many facets to some of the circumstances that are captured in today's report. But before passing first to Mark and then Nicola, I think I would observe that both of the two organisations that you mentioned have been approached or are part of the financial recovery arrangements. So first of all, for UHI in terms of liquidity support, that was sort of £1 million, and then a further, 1.5 million for UHI, then a further £1 million from the Scottish Funding Council of liquidity support. So really there's an onus, for the College Board of Management, given the turnover that we've mentioned, together with the regional strategic body and the Scottish Funding Council, to all collectively be satisfied that some of the events that are set out in today's report have been addressed and there's sufficient capacity and approaches in place that there will not be a repeat. But I'll maybe turn to Mark first of all, Convener, if anything he wants to add.
Thanks, Auditor General. We touched on this, I think, in relation to the Lewis Castle College situation on which we gave evidence some weeks ago. There's clearly a hierarchy of accountability here, and the Auditor General has made quite clear that that starts with the college management and the college board. After that, yes, UHI is a primary funding body. Funds come from the SFC, of course, has a duty to make sure that the funds are being used in the means intended and that the college is complying with all necessary requirements to meet the code of good governance and financial and performance information. There is a financial memorandum between UHI and Perth College, and that sets out the broad expectations. It doesn't get into the detail of specificity of what exactly the information flow should be, but it gives enough there to make clear that UHI has an important role to play. Beyond that, of course, the Scottish Funding Council will have an interest and gathers information from colleges, and it will also have an interest in knowing that UHI is close to it. We haven't examined the specific role of SFC in relation to this one. I think quite clearly the setting of a budget is primarily the responsibility of the college and its board.
And just in terms of the specifics of our audit work, clearly that was very much focused around Perth College and the actions that had been taken by management at the college. We were aware that UHI did have observers attending at some of the board meetings, but again, the clarity of their involvement in some of the issues, we weren't able to be clear about what that was. Once the event started to unfold in March, where there was the administration, there were the resignations, there was the error identified in the budget, we were aware that UHI had written to the college expressing concerns and also appointed a financial consultant to support the college with the development of its financial recovery plan. So clearly action was taken, but management's first responsibility was actually to take those actions, UHI stepping in when things became difficult.
But as I understand it, the exodus of staff, or the big turnover of staff, happened this year, 2025, didn't it? This is the financial year 23-24, where there was a complete absence of any budget. I mean, Auditor General, you're presenting this report to Parliament because you've got serious concerns about what happened. I suppose the question is, why weren't those serious concerns picked up at an earlier point by either UHI or by the Scottish Funding Council?
So I don't think I have a definitive answer that will give clarity about the role of the board, UHI, or the Funding Council convener that would satisfy this. There is a responsibility on one party over another. I think there is a considerable tail to some of the events that are captured in today's report, you'll see there's a number of references to capacity issues within the finance function. Auditors have been reporting on capacity constraints going back to 2017-18 within the college. And the subsequent role of UHI, together with that of the SFC, are relevant. But I think, as Mark says, that responsibility ultimately resides, with the principal and the board of management. And then we, as you've referred to, convener, there's considerable turnover both at a non-executive board member level and official level, which have all are symptomatic of the kind of scale of governance and financial issues. So I don't think what we haven't sought to do in today's report is to pinpoint a particular source or reason why it happened, but I think there are multiple facets of why the report is before the committee. But fundamentally, such feels like it is just such basic fundamentals that a public body needs to prepare a budget in order to evidence its intentions or help deliver its strategy. And the board of UHI Perth did not do that.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the fundamental questions which the committee has got for you this morning is, can you think of many other circumstances where a public body has not set a budget? And similarly and related to that, you make the point in the report that the internal audit function couldn't be relied upon at all. There was no, you couldn't set any store by or place any credence in the internal audit function. I mean, again, I can't remember reading a report where that's been highlighted in such a way.
Yeah, I'll perhaps pass to Nicola if she wants to comment on the internal audit and how that relationship works between external auditors and internal auditors. But on your first point, convener, I similarly can't recall from my time in this role and my career beforehand of auditing public bodies in Scotland of an organisation that hasn't prepared an annual budget. And I think what we tried to do is to set out in the report about some of the circumstances that contributed to a budget not being prepared. And you can see the references to financial challenges within the college, concern about what preparing a deficit budget might mean. Would that have been met with favour by the Scottish Funding Council or otherwise? And then a focus on addressing some of the challenges before them of managing their cost base. Our position is very clear, convener, that even in challenging times, a budget gives an organisation an anchor with which to measure how it's progressing during the course of the year, and then some of the difficult decisions that it may have needed to take in this organisation. So no, I don't have a point of reference. I think perhaps illustrates the seriousness with which prompted us to prepare a statutory report following Nicola's annual audit report on the 23-24 accounts. But if you're content, maybe bring Nicola in to say a bit more about internal audit.
Yes, so perhaps if I just explain the context that we as external auditors consider internal audit. So the way that accounting standards are sort of set out, we are not able to rely on internal audit work. However, we can take it into account when we're performing our risk assessment. So if internal audit find any concerns that are relevant to the external audit, we will take that into account and design procedures to address those risks in our work. I guess the second point about internal audit is usually there is a plan that is set at the beginning of the year, and that plan is usually approved by management of the organisation and the audit committee. So to a certain extent, internal audit work with management to address risks that management are aware of. So that's sort of a relationship that they'll have to make sure that their work is sort of used appropriately. When it comes to the internal audit work, it's my understanding that as part of the 2024-25 programme, due to the concerns that have been identified, that internal audit are doing a wide-ranging piece of work to consider the budgetary controls and wider financial controls to give management some assurance about how that's operating now. But clearly, at a point in time, that wasn't picked up, identified and discussed back in the 23-24 budget setting cycle.
Okay, thanks. And just the final question from me, by way of introduction, before I bring in other members of the committee, is one of the things that you say in the report, which again is very striking, and I can't remember seeing anything equivalent in the past, is that you are unable to explain why no budget was set.
So auditors, and again Nicola can comment on this if she wishes, there is almost always a record of process within a public body. How are decisions arrived at? There were committee meetings, minutes, board meetings and associated minutes, and all of the accompanying papers. So not setting a budget, alongside setting a budget, I think quite reasonably expect that that would be captured in a decision. So a minute of a meeting would set out that the board either did or didn't set a budget. So we couldn't find that. We could see that there is a record of a decision not to set a budget. We make reference and attribute some of the reason behind that, convener, is capacity issues within the college, particularly the finance function, and also the focus on progressing with the financial recovery plan. And these are mitigations, I would say, but they're not strong enough not to have set a budget that would be the underpinning to progress with a financial recovery plan. So no, we've not been able to see any evidence to definitively say that a decision was taken not to set a budget by the Board of Management. But again, I'll just, if by all means, if Nicola wants to add anything to that.
Yes, and I think, so I absolutely support everything Stephen said there about being able to find a written evidential pattern to support that decision. But I think clearly we also have conversations with management to understand, from their perspective what's happened. And I think actually what this demonstrates is the point around the churn in the finance team at senior and more junior levels. So the people that we were dealing with weren't the people that had been around at that point in time, so weren't able to sort of add any additional context for us. And Mr. Leonard, you mentioned at the beginning about sort of senior turnover post the audit year, but actually our experience of through the audit year was that at more low levels within the finance team, there was a significant churn through the finance team, and that included use of interim staff. And again, you don't have that corporate history and knowledge of the entity, and that, you take that with you. It's not always written down. So I think that challenge actually illustrates the point about the impact of the churn in the finance team.
Yeah.
I would just add briefly, convener, I think that ultimately, setting a budget doesn't happen by accident. Organisations should go through engagement process with internally, with officers, and then perhaps with formal and informal engagement with either a finance committee and then the Board of Management for consideration of approval. So we don't have that record of of processes, unfortunately, about what steps were taken. But of course, it should not come as a surprise that an organisation needs to set a budget. This was part and parcel of, and the processes within UHI Perth. So there was a departure from standard processes in 2023-24. And the standard processes are set out in their financial regulations that say that the organisation is required to prepare a budget and for that to be considered and approved by the Board of Management. So I think, unfortunately, as we've said in our judgment, it represents a significant failure.
OK, I'm going to move things along and invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Thanks, convener. So just on that point, this was a one-off then. This is the only year that there's not been a budget.
That's correct.
So something must have happened in that year, but you can't figure out what it was.
So what we can't figure out is that there was a documented decision not to take a budget for the 23-24. But we can, I think as we've made reference to in the report, that there were issues of, as Nicholas just touched on, real financial capacity concerns within the organisation. But I think it's allowed us to go more widely than that, Mr Simpson, that even if there were financial capacity issues, there's an onus upon the Board of Management to say, well, actually, we must consider a budget setting process and ultimately, as a board, take a view as to whether or not we plan to accept or set the budget or not. And as I say, with some mitigation, we absolutely recognise that there were financial challenges within the college. They were exploring reasons or mechanisms with which to improve their financial position. Some quite difficult decisions about course arrangements, the number of employees that they would have to have. But our view remains that those decisions would be supported by better decision-making, improved governance had a budget been set, and we didn't see that.
Okay. Can I take you to paragraph 16 on page 7 of the report, which said that UHI Perth's appointed auditor, I assume that's you, Nicola, informed the board that the preparation and monitoring of a budget is a crucial element of monitoring the financial position of the college. The auditor recommended that the college produce and monitor a budget each financial year. Statement of the obvious, really. So, at what point were you having that discussion, and what was the response?
So, obviously, our 23-24 audit work was performed sort of towards the end of last calendar year. So that was part of our wider scope work that we were looking at financial management and financial sustainability. So we did raise it with management, and management's response was to acknowledge that that had not been done. We had the conversation about the underpinning reasons, which, you know, given the sort of members of staff we were talking to, we weren't necessarily able to fully get to the bottom of. But management's response was that they were preparing a 24-25 budget. Clearly that was delayed. So actually they were responding to the issues that had happened previously. Clearly we felt it was very important that we raised this in our wider scope work. And then as we were completing our audit, and there were delays to the audit, which we may or may not touch on, as we were completing our work, it came to our attention that there had also been issues around the 24-25 budget, which had led to the request for additional support. So we felt that it was important that we raised the profile of the history of what had happened, given the issues that were still clearly, although improving, still of concern to us.
So, just so I've got the timescales right, you came in at a point where it was too late to rectify what happened.
Yes, because budgets are set at the start of the financial year, and our audit work is retrospective. Yes.
Okay, so there was not, in your view, there was nothing that could have been done to stop this problem arising.
Well, I suppose it depends whether you mean from an audit standpoint or a management standpoint, because clearly, at a board level, that, you know, the fact that there was not a budget could have been challenged at any point from when that budget should have been approved through the year, clearly, and that would have been management's responsibility. From an audit perspective, clearly at the point we come in, the year is completed, so we sort of flagged the issue and then we looked ahead and had conversations with management about the position for 24-25, given our concerns about what had happened around 23-24.
So from an auditor's point of view, you come in when it's already happened, it's too late, there's nothing you could have done. You just discover what's gone on.
That's right.
And you have discussions more or less along the lines of, well, that shouldn't have happened, don't let it happen again.
Essentially, yes.
Basically, yeah.
I mean, I think so. An audit is a primarily retrospective function, but I think it comes down to roles and responsibilities. The responsibility to prepare a budget rests with officers, but ultimately the board. And I think, you know, maybe paragraph 15 kind of perhaps, you know, best captures, I suppose, as much of the insight I think as we've been able to get through the audit process, Mr. Simpson, that the board seemed to be grappling with the recognition that they had financial challenges and to therefore explore whether they could or couldn't prepare a deficit budget. And then some of the accompanying decisions that they were faced with, you know, which we set out some of the bullets at paragraph 12. So, you know, academic reorganisation, management of their estates, reorganisation, you know, with other parts of the college. But I think we're pretty clear that ultimately these were decisions for the board, and that it's not just custom and practice, as I say. You know, their financial regulations are clear that this is, you know, a fundamental part of their financial monitoring and control environment is the annual budget.
Yeah, okay. I'll come on to paragraph 15 in a second, but if I can just go back, Nicola, to the discussions you had. Once you discovered this had happened, you must have asked, well, why did this happen? Did nobody explain it properly?
So I think, as the report sets out, we were given indications of causal factors. So the fact that there was a deficit budget, the fact that there was work ongoing and a reduced capacity really in the finance team to deal with that. So there were prioritisation of actually where effort would go. But actually the people that we were speaking to were not actually part of that. The finance sort of senior members that we were dealing with were quite new to the organisation, so hadn't been part of that discussion. And as Stephen's pointed out, the documentation surrounding it is not very clear. So as a consequence, we were just able to sort of draw inferences rather than be able to definitively say this is why it was done and this is how it's documented.
Okay. So we'll go back to paragraph 15, which we've referenced already. If I could just read that out. Board papers show members discuss the possibility of agreeing a deficit budget, and UHI confirmed it was an option that it would discuss with the SFC. The board wanted to achieve a balanced budget. There was a degree of reluctance to agree a deficit budget and uncertainty over whether the SFC would permit it. It's unclear from the board papers whether there was a resolution to those discussions. Have you got any other information on the discussions that UHI plan to have with the Scottish Funding Council?
The only thing I would add, and Nicola might want to say more, I'm sure, is that I think I'm right in saying that they have now set a deficit budget for 24-25. So that is a mechanism that is available to the college, Mr Simpson. But in terms of the to and fro that took place between UHI Perth and the Funding Council and the regional strategic body, I don't have that detail to hand, unless Nicola can offer any further insight.
So clearly our primary audit is of Perth, so we didn't have separate discussions with UHI or the SFC, but I would observe that in some other matters, some of the evidence that we were seeking actually was verbal conversations. So actually, as auditors, the best evidence that can be given to us is written evidence, correspondence between bodies. But actually, in some of the other areas we were looking at, a number of those interactions were verbal. So, you know, we would need to follow that up if you were interested in exploring that further. But I would expect that some of that would have been verbal as opposed to written interactions anyway.
Okay. Yeah, Mark.
We know from reviewing the college's board papers that the Regional Strategic Board, i.e. UHI in this case, was liaising with the Scottish Funding Council about the college's financial pressures. And I think I'm right in saying, and Nicola may know more on this, in autumn 2024 the Scottish Funding Council did provide UHI Perth with £1.5 million of liquidity funding. So it was clear that the Funding Council was aware of the challenges the college was facing and was engaged with UHI and presumably also the college. I don't think that necessarily means that everyone was aware that there was no budget underpinning some of that, which you would have thought would have been an obvious thing to explore.
I think, if I may, Mr Simpson, I think it's an important distinction, actually. Although we're challenging that there was a breadth of understanding across the Board of Management, UHI and the Scottish Funding Council that the college was experiencing financial problems. I think what we're not clear on whether there was a consensus, if I put it in those terms, and therefore don't prepare a budget for 23-24. I think, at the risk of speculating, I think that feels unlikely, that there would be an acceptance that the college should not prepare a budget or not take a formal decision to do so. So I think our point still stands that actually, regardless of the financial challenges, managing those challenges would have been better served by preparing a budget.
So you're not really clear whether there was actually a formal decision not to have a budget?
I've seen that. So we've not seen that. We've not. There is not a recorded decision not to prepare a budget, and we think there needs to be a formal process in any organisation to consider the budget and for the board to approve the budget or not. And in not approving a budget, it's not just a binary approve or not approve. If you're not going to approve a budget, it's what things do you want changed, and then for it to return to the board for further consideration, as opposed to what feels like an elongated process of focusing on financial recovery measures and delivering against those, but as I say, but then not having the formal mechanism. And you might say this is is this a technicality? And I don't think it is. I think this is a fundamental part of how the board could have supported the college through some of the challenges, to know what it was targeting in terms of its strategic priorities reflected in some of the financial choices it would have made.
Okay. I just want to go into this a little bit deeper, because what I can't get clear is you Nicola, you're coming in, you're discovering something that shouldn't have happened. There should have been a budget. There wasn't a budget. If I was you, I would want to know why. I would want to find the people who were responsible for that and ask them, why did that come about? Did you do that?
We asked those questions, but we were unable to get clarity of answers, and there's only so far you can go. So we report it, we look forward, we look at what's happened in 24, 25, and then sort of we move on, looking to help make improvements. So we asked those questions. We absolutely had the intellectual curiosity to ask those questions, but there were not answers available to us.
Is that because people that you spoke to were trying to put you off the scent? They were waffling, they were dancing around the houses?
No, and I think it's important that I sort of am clear. So clearly, as we started the 23-24 audit, it became evident that there were going to be delays, that there was not capacity in the finance team to service an audit at that point. And at that point, my role is to step in, speak to senior management and have a conversation about, actually, this is not progressing, we need to take action. And actually, my experiences of the senior individuals I dealt with was that they were responsive and transparent and supportive of us. And I think that also plays out in their transparency with us in March and April as things sort of unwound and we had to sort of take further audit action. So as I was having those conversations, clearly it's uncomfortable that they were unable to articulate what had happened, but equally I did not feel that was deliberately evasive. I felt that it was a reflection of the difficulties that the organisation had undergone with lots of changing of staff, etc. So I suppose in any audit you have to make a decision about the value of the effort and where you place it. So we could have pursued that, but actually, as you've mentioned, it's sort of a done deal. They hadn't set the budget. So then, knowing that had happened, knowing that had not been monitored against, we then started saying, well, actually, what's happening moving forward? What recommendations can we make that actually contribute to improvements in the organisation? And sort of what further actions do we need to take from an audit perspective to make sure we're comfortable signing the financial statements?
Okay, well, maybe we'll have more luck if we get people in. You never know. I've just got one more question. It relates to paragraph 14 on page 7. That says, current college staff suggested to us that the college prioritise resourcing work to address financial sustainability over setting an in-year budget for 23-24. So was it clear who within the college may have made the decision to prioritise resourcing work?
I'll maybe ask Nicola to pick that, but I think that's been the consistent theme, Mr Simpson, around that time of capacity constraints. And as I mentioned to the convener a few moments ago, that it's not a new situation that the college found themselves in, that there had been constraints within their finance function dating back many years that don't appear to have been adequately addressed to allow them to support the effective management of public funding that goes to the college, to support governance decisions that needed to be taken either. But a decision was taken, and Nicola may have more insight into who took this decision, recognising some of the turnover that took place. But the priority, as you say, was to progress with some of the recovery steps that needed, or the board considered needed to be taken, as opposed to the formality of the annual budget setting. But again, Nicola may know more.
Yeah, so I'm afraid I have no insight about who actually made the decision, but I guess from, just reflecting on my experience of audits and of organisations, clearly that financial sustainability work feeds into the setting of a budget, because you can set a budget based on the prior year, but actually it's a deficit budget. So actually that financial recovery work was planned to feed into what would have been the budget, but clearly capacity constraints meant that the two things couldn't run side by side. And, colleges are not organisations, if I compare it to my experience of working with larger councils or NHS organisations where you have a wider pool of finance professionals, so you're able to sort of deploy your resource differently. Colleges do have smaller finance teams, so actually when you experience turnover or resignations, you are then exposed to just not having that depth to sort of redeploy staff, and so the recruitment challenges that were subsequently faced meant that, I guess, difficult decisions had to be made. What I'm not able to comment on is who made them, because again, that history of that time is not something we were able to unpick very clearly.
Okay, a few unanswered questions, convener, but I'll leave it there.
Yep, okay. And I think that I read a report that suggested that under the principal and CEO who's now left, but who's the principal at the time of the audit, there were 5 different finance directors, which again is an interesting indication of the instability of that function inside the college.
Yeah, I think it's a very clear example, convener, quite striking, actually, that level of turnover of senior people will inevitably have had a disruptive effect. Something the committee may want to explore, but I think it's the relationship of UHI Perth with UHI as the regional strategic. And I think, as we note at paragraph 36, and suppose some of the response to support UHI Perth is that UHI is supporting a vice principal for strategic projects in UHI Perth. So, but unfortunately, I'm not clear as to the extent to which UHI was approached or offered support at the time where some of the issues came to the fore.
Questions in that area later on, but can I now turn to Colin Beattie to ask you some questions? Colin.
Thank you, Convener. General, I'm looking at paragraph 16 of your report where it says UHI Perth's appointed auditor. That implies it's an external third party who's doing the audit function?
Yes, that's correct, Mr Beattie. The appointed auditor is Deloitte. So I think in terms of the model for public audit in Scotland, I appoint the auditors of further education colleges, NHS Board and central government. Typically about 2/3 of the audits are carried out by members of Audit Scotland staff, and then the remainder undertaken by firms. So the appointed auditor is Nicola Wright through her work with Deloitte.
Okay. Now, internal audit. Are they doing that in-house?
No, I believe that is provided by another independent firm, so they're appointed to carry out the internal audit. But the college appoints the internal auditor as opposed to the external auditor, which is appointed through Audit Scotland.
And Audit Scotland has no part in that appointment?
No, absolutely we don't. And that's very clearly a matter for the board of management of the college to determine the size, scale, personnel of any internal audit service. Mark might want to comment on this. I know the committee has been interested in internal audit arrangements in colleges in previous years about size and scale, but this is a matter and a decision for the board of management.
I don't really have much to add. As far as I understand it, nearly all colleges will have a separately appointed internal audit function. I think it's rare for colleges to have a college team that does the internal audit. It's usually an accountancy firm or an audit firm.
Given the fact that internal audit there is an external function, the problems there have been going on for years. Are you satisfied that that internal audit function was adequately reporting the issues that were arising over the years, and the recurring one, and most particularly within the finance area?
I think it's actually a question more for the board of management rather than it is for us as the external auditors. Nicola can...
looking in?
Yeah, I think so. Internal audit are described as they're a tool of management, so they are appointed by management, reporting to the audit committee. They'll have a programme of proposed internal audits that they will undertake on behalf of the organisation, and that will be reported to the audit committee, with the audit committee to determine the effectiveness of the work of the internal auditors. More often than not, Mr Beattie, that will be for a set period of time on a contractual arrangement, and then tendered publicly again thereafter. Again, I might pass to Nicola. I think if she wants to build upon some of the dynamic and the relationship between internal and external audit. But I think, as Nicola mentioned, external audit is required to discharge its own responsibilities. So in Scotland, meeting the Code of Audit Practice, compliance with international standards on auditing. In years gone by, there used to be quite a more common set of circumstances where an external auditor would rely directly on the work of an internal auditor and almost augment some audit activity that the external auditor would undertake. But with recent changes in auditing standards and some of the necessity for external auditors to satisfy themselves with their own quality and compliance with the requirements of our regulators, that's becoming more unusual. So whilst they both carry the title audit in their responsibilities, there's something of a parallel process rather than an overlapping one. But it is very clearly the judgment of the Board of Management as to how effectiveness the work of the internal auditors were.
It presumably looks at the internal audit processes and makes sure that they are adequate for the job.
And certainly, again, Nicola can come in on this point, actually, just to say how that worked in UHI Perth.
There's probably a couple of things I would say. So firstly, internal audit is part of a wider control environment in an organisation. So the primary responsibility for setting controls and ensuring they're operating sits with management. So management should have controls in place that they are confident are operating to ensure that governance standards are met. Internal audit is a tool of management, so you can use internal audit to come in and independently give you assurance that you may think these controls are operating, but actually they'll do some testing and confirm that back to you. Internal audit's programme is very much set by management. So internal audit will talk to management about what are the significant risks, business risks, operational risks that the organisation faces, and then we'll have a conversation about this is our budget. For provision of internal audit services, we will point to you at the highest risk areas, the areas where we have concerns, or some core areas each year, some core financial controls, to make sure they're operating. So there's an element, if internal audit will have a view about what they should do, but management can direct internal audit to some degree. External audit is based on a series of separately set rules and requirements. So we are purely independent, we follow a certain programme each year, and management can't influence that. That is decided by the rules that are there. So in terms of our understanding of internal audit, what we would usually do is we'd ensure they were appointed, we would ensure they were attending meetings. Usually internal audit report to management each year on their compliance with internal audit standards. So they'll present a charter, they'll sort of talk about their own quality assurance processes to assure management that the work they're doing is up to a certain standard. As long as they're doing that, we wouldn't dip any deeper into what they do, because a number of things that they do aren't directly relevant to the external audit. So what we tend to do is we read their reports, we look at any high-risk findings, and we consider, do those high-risk findings impact on our external audit work? If they do, we may do additional procedures to make sure that we are covering off any risks that our internal audit have identified.
So you read the reports, and presumably these reports will reflect the deficiencies in the finance area extending over a number of years.
So they will report on the controls that they have tested, but that might not be a comprehensive review. It will be reviews on specific areas as set out in the plan and as agreed with management.
Okay. Okay, just moving on, I'm not quite sure in some parts of that. There were issues about £1 million of errors in the 24-25 budget. Are these directly related to that particular financial year, or do they extend back into previous years but were only found in 24-25?
So clearly we have not completed our audit for 24-25, so that is ongoing as we speak. So my knowledge of those errors, The reason they came to light is we were due to sign our financial statements in March of this year. And one of the procedures that we carry out is we talk to management for subsequent events. So effectively, we ask management, has anything happened between the end of the year that we're auditing and the point of signing that we need to be aware of so that we can take it into account in our audit? As part of that, management shared with us a range of issues. So we've mentioned already the administration of the subsidiary. There were some changes at senior level, but also it was shared with us that management had identified some errors in the 24-25 budget that meant that they would need to go back and have conversations with UHI and with the SFC about some additional liquidity support. So we became aware of it through that route. Anecdotally, they are specific to 24-25, so they sounded, you know, I don't wish to go into detail because we haven't completed the work, but they sounded straightforward issues, but that were relevant to 24-25. But we will absolutely be looking at that as part of the audit that we're currently doing and considering any additional recommendations or findings that we need to report.
The question I was going to ask you is, what are these errors?
So we are in the middle of that work, so I'm not quite sure it's appropriate to go into the detail, but they were errors identified by management and flagged to UHI to consider the impact on the budget.
I mean, they are fairly important. I mean,
yes.
£1 million, a lot of errors. What is the total balance sheet for the college?
So are we talking income and expenditure or overall balance sheet?
I'm just trying to work out what does £1 million represent in terms of the overall.
So in terms of the individual college in last year's accounts, the overall income was 26 million. And the balance sheet itself, sort of net assets were about 39 million.
So it's fairly.
It's not insignificant. It's not insignificant.
No. Yeah. But you can't tell us what they are.
My apologies. Could you repeat that?
You can't tell us what the errors are.
So I think Nicholas hopefully conveyed, Mr. Beattie, is that Deloitte's work is ongoing during the 24-25 audit. If we have more detail on that, we can come back to the committee in writing, but I think it's probably one for the college themselves to convey that detail in public to the committee rather than the external auditor. Well, I think hopefully your content is it represents it's a significant material sum, and by coincidence, of similar size to the level of liquidity support that the college is looking for from firstly from UHI and now with Scottish Funding Council. So these are significant amounts that require support.
They're looking for as an addition to the £1.5 million that's already agreed.
Yes, that's correct, and that's subject to, in terms of where that's in the process. This is part of the financial recovery process, has been, and I think perhaps indicative of my opening remarks of some signs of more optimism within the financial management and governance arrangements within the college, with a new committee set up within the board to oversee the delivery of the financial recovery programme, support from UHI in terms of additional personnel, and then ongoing fortnightly engagement just to see that process is working well. But it's illustrative. These are significant material amounts that the college needs to actively manage and monitor to support its financial sustainability.
And clearly, this committee would be keen to understand what the nature of these errors were, and as soon as they can be released, we would want to know.
And the committee, I hope, can be assured that as Deloitte conclude their work, that will be set out as part of their 24-25 annual report, together with any considerations I give to any further public reporting. I think as we look to set out in the report, there is something of an overlap of financial years by virtue of some of the delays that were encountered during the course of the audit process, some of the financial capacity issues, that we took a view that it would tell an incomplete story to focus solely on some of the financial results for 23-24. This is important context for this committee and Parliament's consideration of some of the financial challenges at UHI Perth. So what I fear that we've done in some ways is we've set out some additional context, but as you can hear, not able to give you some of that additional detail as to the reasons, but that detail will be coming either in advance from the college themselves or in due course through our annual audit reporting.
But you can confirm that the £1 million is solely related to the 24-25 budget?
So that's what we set out in the report. So paragraph 25 and one UHI Perth identified £1 million of errors in its 24-25 budget.
Now, there were also errors in the cash flow calculations for 24-25. What were they?
So again, our work is ongoing, so what we don't have is a definitive answer to that question, but it is something that we are looking at as part of the programme of work. Our work has effectively commenced this week, so we will bring more information in our report to the board and subsequently through Stephen.
So I think what the detail, as I say, Mr. Beattie, can be provided by the college. But I think what we're seeing is that these errors, together with errors in the cash flow statement, cash flow calculations rather, and the overall budget, were of such significance to the financial sustainability of the college that it warranted requests for external funding support. So the detail of it matters absolutely, and that will be forthcoming to the committee. But again, it's the significance of whilst a budget was set, and that is welcome for 24-25, it's not yet one that you consider as adequately robust enough to satisfy the Board of Management and the Parliament that it was adequate in order to give confidence that public money was being discharged properly. So matters still to be worked on at the college, no doubt.
Would the cause of these errors be related to the issues within the finance area?
So again, I need to be careful because it's a little anecdotal, the conversations that we had around the signing of it. My understanding is that, yes, when you have a lot of churn in a finance team, particularly at senior levels, the people that review budgets, that are responsible for some of these things, you lose a bit of that corporate memory, so things that are known, people that have that knowledge of the organisation. So it's my understanding that that will be a factor, that people who were doing some of this work potentially didn't have that sort of knowledge of the entity. But again, I need to be very clear here that we have not completed our work. It is really just starting, and this is absolutely something we're considering when we're doing those procedures for 24-25.
I would maybe just add, so whilst there's some anecdotal aspects to perhaps attributing responsibility to that, I think as the convener mentions that the scale of turnover at senior levels within the organisation, it's not unreasonable to say that that will have had an impact upon the capacity, the support that senior finance officials would be providing to the Board of Management, the scrutiny that then ensued. So these points, in my view, are all related.
On a little, in your report you mentioned that UHI has raised concerns with the college following the errors that were identified. Do you know if this is the first time that UHI has raised concerns with the college?
So I'm afraid we don't know that. We have seen the correspondence around that specific time, but I couldn't comment on the previous history of interactions with UHI. I think that would probably be a matter for UHI and the college.
Okay, so that closes that one down too. Okay, just to move on. This is the third Section 22 report that the committee's looked at where a college has had problems with their commercial subsidiary, which has given them difficulties. Are you seeing any sort of recurring theme here? Is it that the colleges don't have the management skills to do this?
So Nicola may wish to say more about some of the circumstances as it relates to her audit of Air Services Training, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of UHI Perth. I think there are some governance factors that are relevant and that are perhaps kind of localised at UHI Perth that she may want to touch on. More broadly, and again, Mark can perhaps offer a perspective on this too. You're right, Mr. Beattie, we have highlighted in some of our previous reporting that as colleges undertake a range of activities, so some of those will be done under the umbrella of the college themselves, and some of them through subsidiaries where they are more commercial activities, and that's reasonable. And some commercial activities are successful, and some not. But I think we have stepped back to an extent and said that where colleges are undertaking more commercial activities, and I should say perhaps that doesn't confine myself just to colleges, this is relevant for other parts of the public sector too, that they should satisfy themselves that they've got the right level of governance, financial, commercial expertise to do so, that they are aware of the risks and are appropriately managing those risks. But it is noted that you mentioned this is the third instance where a college has engaged in more commercial activity with third parties. That has been a contributory factor in some of the circumstances brought before this committee. I'll pass to Nicola first and perhaps say a bit more about some of the circumstances here, and then if anything Mark wants to add across the piece.
On whether there is a common theme there as to the reasons behind the failures.
Yeah, so I guess our work was very much focused around the Perth situation and our understanding around the circumstances around the subsidiary. We're not the auditors to the subsidiary, but the conversations we've had have been around declining student numbers in the provision of the subsidiary. I think one of the areas that is a focus of our 24-25 work, because clearly this was a March and April of this year issue, is just going to be around the governance arrangements that exist between the subsidiary and the college. So, so we've already had some initial conversations about separation in terms of governance. Was there separation between the subsidiary and the college? How quickly were the issues reported once they became evident? Were they flagged on risk registers and reported appropriately at a college level to allow that level of oversight and understanding? It did feel from an audit perspective like it unwound quite quickly. However, what we want to do is understand, was there any sort of underlying reporting that we're not aware of? But certainly the governance arrangements between the two will be an area of focus for us and currently are a concern that we need to sort of bottom out.
Okay, just moving on to one last thing, which is about the staffing situation, that senior staffing situation, which you referred to previously. The latest Director of Finance resigned in April 25, Principal resigned in May 25, 5 members of the Board of Management, including the Chair, also resigned between April and May 25. That's on paragraph 27 of your report. Can you provide any further information on these resignations and the recruitment that's taking place to replace them?
I'll maybe start in reverse, and actually, if Nicola's in, she wants to add in terms of the reason why there's been such a turnover. In terms of replacement, so we set out, I think, at the report, there's an interim principal now in place with arrangements through to the spring of 2026. There's also an interim finance director filling that vacancy, as I mentioned a moment or two ago, with some direct support from a vice principal at UHI Perth to support some of the capacity constraints within the college, together with arrangements for chairing of the Board of Management too, Mr. Beattie. So these are important, to give some stability. I think I would put it in those terms for UHI Perth. In due course, through the right processes, the board, together with the regional strategic body, will want to satisfy itself that they've got the right people, the right structures to deliver for the students in the community of Perth and surrounding area. So I think I would characterise it as there has been some stabilisation, because some of the volume of turnover at senior posts and on the board is hugely significant, and it must have a risk of a destabilising effect on the functions of the college. So I would, as I say, I think there is a stabilisation that is happening at the moment, rather than one that necessarily offers assurance to this committee or students that matters have been fully resolved and there is a clear plan with effective governance on it. But in some of the detail, if Nicola wants to say about some of the background.
These resignations took place within a fairly tight period in 2025.
Yes.
Was there a trigger for that?
So I think it's so we did do some audit work around that, because clearly when there are resignations of senior members of an organisation, you do want to understand if there are any underlying considerations, so any sort of concerns about the organisation itself that would mean we would need to undertake additional procedures. So we sort of had a series of meetings with some of the people who had left and existing members of the college, and I think it's fair to say there was a mixed sort of set of reasons, some actually personal. So some people shared with us there were personal reasons they couldn't continue in that role. I think clearly when there's a trigger such as the administration of the subsidiary and the errors in the budget all coming together, that does prompt sort of, particularly if you are not remunerated or non-executive, for example, you might want to consider, actually, is this sort of the right role for you? So I think clearly those events all happening together prompted perhaps, people to sort of make their minds up about what they wanted to do moving forward. But there was a mix of reasons, and actually we were satisfied there weren't any additional issues from an audit perspective that we need to do any work around. We do recognise that it was destabilising, as Stephen said. We recognise a huge amount of work has gone into putting in place people to stabilise the organisation. But I guess I would also note that a number of those roles are interim. So although there is stabilisation, clearly there will come a point when you'll be looking for substantive appointments for all the reasons that we've discussed around corporate memory, setting strategy, giving confidence to staff, those sorts of reasons.
Given the sheer volume of the turnover, even if the new people coming in are experienced non-execs and all the rest of it, they'll still need some support because, that is a huge wrench in terms of the management of the college. Is there any external support for this, maybe from UHI or whatever?
Yes, I agree with you. And there is. So there is support being provided by the Vice Principal, UHI's Vice Principal for Strategic Projects, who has joined UHI Perth's strategic leadership team on a temporary part-time advisory role. I think it would be for the Board of Management and for UHI to determine, is that the level of support sufficient? Would they want to add any further? Along with, I touched on a moment or two ago, external governance changes within the college to see them through this challenging period. I think it is a welcome introduction of a new committee within the college to oversee the financial recovery plan. And we will monitor those arrangements, how governance is operating through Nicola's audit of 24-25, Mr Beattie. But what we would characterise as steps have been taken, but it's ultimately for UHI and UHI Perth to satisfy themselves that these investments of additional capacity are working.
And just one last question. Do you have a view on whether boards of public bodies should be held accountable for their failure to document or act on key financial decisions? Because, this committee has commented in the past that these issues arise in governance and whatnot, and people just resign and move on and get another job elsewhere in another public organisation or another part of a public organisation. Where is accountability?
So I think there's a couple of. I think this is a live example of accountability, I would say. So we're reporting publicly on how well an organisation in the Scottish public sector has performed in its use of public money, how effective those arrangements have been. So there's accountability to this Parliament. Similarly, through accountable officer arrangements, there's a direct accountability for those appointed individuals to this committee. And then equally, the committee has heard in recent weeks from the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life that if there is, and his oversight extends to public boards in the round. So beyond that, I think that would be a wider consideration discussion, perhaps led by this committee, is whether you are satisfied that that is sufficient, or is there more that the committee would wish to explore in terms of accountability. But I would never underestimate the impact that a public report can do in the work of this committee. This is taken incredibly seriously, I know, by public bodies and board members. No public body relishes the prospect of accountability at this committee. But beyond that, I think that's perhaps a discussion that this committee might want to lead, if that is sufficient.
And just on the back of what you said there, is there any hint, perhaps, that there's the people who resigned during that period, or some of them, may have had concerns about the report that was coming out, and so got out before the report hit the streets? And are there any who might have been held accountable for the errors and concerns that have arisen?
I don't have any detailed insight into that about the personal motivations as to why either officials or board members would have sought to end their time with UHI Perth. Nicola may have more detail to share if she does. But I think the scale of challenges that we're capturing were well known, and I think Nicola mentioned similarly that people will want to consider what this means for their own service, their own reputation, careers, and take a view whether they can better serve a public body by remaining on an organisation or leaving. Resignation of public board members is an important tool in their armour. If they feel that they have explored avenues to support change and not been able to initiate it, then I'm not sure I would always conclude that a resignation is indicative of somebody's failure in a role. It might be actually the opposite, that they have done all they can and not been able to support the change that they felt necessary. But Nicola may have wished to add.
I mean, we are not aware of anybody who has left as a consequence of this report or any of sort of the audit findings. But I do recognise that it's a challenging time. So if you're working in an organisation with a lot of churn, actually your ability to do your job and you feeling comfortable as a professional in that environment, I could see personally how that would be, that would put you in a difficult position, and you would think about how comfortable you were remaining in that role. But we're not aware of anybody that we think has left. And actually, a lot of the churn that we saw really was at the beginning, before this was even a consideration, when this was just an ongoing piece of audit work.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we've still got two members of the committee with questions to ask, so if we could press on, that would be helpful. Deputy Convener, Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Convener. Can I thank Mr Beattie for covering many of my areas of questioning? That will save some time. I would like to ask two very specific questions, one around the deficit and another around capacity to produce reports. I was quite struck by paragraph 15. I'm reading between the lines, perhaps, but can you just explain to me what happened here? So it seems to me that the board, and I'm intrigued by the board's role in all of this, they seem reluctant or unwilling to produce a budget which showed a deficit, and there was there was an appetite, if you like, to show balanced books to produce. But obviously that was impossible. There was a huge deficit. Was there any? Did you get the feeling there was any conflict there around the data, the management data that the board were being presented, and their unwillingness, or even indeed, where did that unwillingness come from to want to just be honest about the numbers?
So I think, setting a deficit budget, so, clearly deficit budgets are not expected. We expect to set a balanced budget in any organisation. So I think setting a deficit budget is challenging as a board to be able to say that you cannot manage the financial position within the funding. So I think that is a challenge for a board to do. We don't audit the management data or the sort of savings data, but I do know there were a series of work streams that the organisation was looking at. But again, quite challenging ones around reduction of headcounts, changing of courses, redundancy schemes, etc. So I think clearly, as a board, they were going to have to make some very difficult decisions, and sort of this is wrapped up in that. Those decisions really would have allowed them to set a balanced budget, but they hadn't made those decisions at that time. So I suspect the conflict really came from the difficulty of the decisions that needed to be taken to produce a balanced budget.
But in your experience, is it okay to say, look, we're spending more money than we have? It's just being honest, isn't it?
It's interesting. So we do sometimes have, theoretical conversations, not specifically this entity, where, it's about, do you report what you want the position to be, or do you report the position as is? And I think, you have to be courageous and brave as a board to say, actually, it's this bad. And we'll report that to our sort of regulatory organisations. So, you get different, it's a cultural thing, you get different perspectives at different organisations. Clearly this was an organisation at that time struggling with the ability to say, we can't balance the budget, we need to set a deficit budget, and that has unwound through the events that we've discussed today. And
my understanding is that the root factors of the deficits stemmed from three particular areas. One was negotiating pay settlements, which were part of national bargaining, which they obviously had a knock-on effect locally to adhere to. Issues around the air training scheme, which I'll come on to separately, because that's another interesting development. And the third, what was the third reason for the deficit? Drop in student numbers. So I guess projected student numbers, full-time equivalents versus what they actually got in terms of course take-up. Now, I actually had a look at their course brochure just while you were speaking, and it's quite a wide and varied range of courses that one can do, covering FE and HE. So, you know, was there any feedback as to why the numbers came so low in terms of forecasts versus actuals?
So I suppose from our perspective, we didn't really look at that. We just looked at the actual outturn and the budget. I don't know whether there's any sort of more sectoral commentary that you sort of want to make. I mean, you know, from our wider work, we do see that student numbers are a challenge, and, you know, optimistic budgeting can be a concern. Not saying that's the case here, but that is a challenge within the sector. Yeah,
I think, as Nicola mentions, that, you know, this is, you know, a sectoral issue. But the three factors you identified, Deputy Convener, you know, all contributed in part to the £2 million adjusted operating deficit within the college. Mark and I will be briefing the committee over the next few weeks on some of the overview conclusions that we have reached on Scotland's colleges and some of the challenge around student numbers, which students they are, relative assumptions, as you mentioned, are they HE or FE students, and what that means for the provision of courses, together with the financial position of the sector. Happy to say a wee bit more if you wish at the moment, Mark, or we can share some of that insight in more detail when we brief the committee on that report.
I look forward to that, and obviously there's been a lot of discussion around that, the wider sustainability of the college sector. The SFC reported that 22 out of 24 colleges have an unsustainable financial future, for example. Is that reflective of what you saw at UHI? Is this just a small piece in the wider jigsaw of a more systemic issue around college funding?
So there's undoubtedly, you know, significant financial challenges within Scotland's colleges, and colleges are taking steps to address that, either in terms of, you know, course provision, management of headcount. You know, as we've talked to the committee in recent years on our college reporting, some of the reduction in staff numbers that have taken place through voluntary and compulsory redundancy arrangements. And then also just on Mr Beattie's line of questioning about exploration of other income and how they can augment some of the funding challenges through other sources. So these are all the recurring themes that we've set out in the overview report, and as I say, very happy to get into some of the detail on that in the coming weeks.
And this is where perhaps I'm a bit confused, is because they clearly were trying to expand income streams, as a lot of colleges are doing, by looking at sectoral specific schemes that encourage commercial interest or can feed a pipeline of well-trained resource into growth industries. If we look at the example from Perth, the Air Services training subsidiary, which had been around for nearly 100 years and had trained thousands of pilots and engineers over the years, in a growth market where there's a massive, huge worldwide shortage for aircraft maintenance engineers, yet that went bust. So there, you know, the market was there, the sector was growing. Are there management issues that you're seeing? Perhaps is it a strategic problem here? Or what? I mean, it doesn't marry up to me as to why that business particularly should go bust of all businesses.
So I guess there's a couple of things that maybe to start, and then I'll pass to Nicola if she's able to say more. Is that neither Audit Scotland nor Deloitte are the auditors of UHI Perth Air Service Training subsidiary. What we've looked to do to capture in today's report is the financial consequences of that are reflected in UHI Perth as the parent. We haven't done an audit because it doesn't capture, not part of our responsibility. I don't audit commercial subsidiaries of public bodies, but rather to say that to satisfy ourselves that, you know, the governance as it relates to the college is adequate. So it's not to absolutely acknowledge your interest in this area, but there are boundaries, first of all, in terms of our responsibilities, and then whilst some of that may be covered, but it will only be covered through Deloitte's 24-25 audit, to the extent to which that was relevant for UHI Perth, and any consideration that Nicola and our colleagues wish to make about what that might mean for recommendations for UHI Perth's overall arrangements, rather than being able to give you the detail behind why the subsidiary went into administration, Deputy Convener. But
yeah, that being said, though, I mean, Audit Scotland, it's not the first time you've come to the committee with a Section 22 report on a college which has had a commercial subsidiary. We can point to numerous examples. So there is a pattern emerging in the evidence that we take that you produce that show that there is a direct relationship between some of these commercial subsidiaries the college is operating, some of the financial issues that poses the colleges or the bodies that are partners to those entities, and therefore the effect that has on their accounts and their audit.
And equally can be the case that having a commercial subsidiary can be hugely successful. And there are many examples in Scotland's colleges where those arrangements are in place and thriving, and supporting the wider objectives of the college and their financial position at the same time. So I'm cautious about giving any impression that colleges or wider public bodies shouldn't do commercial activities, but of course they should. So if as part of their scheme of establishment, their standing orders and delegations and so forth, but that these arrangements are managed and the risks are understood. So I wouldn't want to attribute some of the recent reporting to say that this is symptomatic that subsidiaries are not being well managed in Scotland's college, but rather to recognise that these are risks to be managed, Deputy Convener, and to say that through Deloitte's audit of 24-25, we should be in a position to give some additional insight on some of the circumstances on AST through the 24-25 UHI Perth audit. But again, if Nicola wishes to say anything further just now, she's more than welcome to.
Yes, all I'd say is clearly we will be looking at the governance and sort of how that situation unwound. But it's my understanding that the college did explore options around AST, whether it was commercially viable in a different form, etc. But again, that would be for the college to talk through. But we waited for that situation to play out, and then the administration sort of meant that we could then go ahead and sign our opinion because there was a resolution, but there was a period when sort of options were being considered.
Moving to paragraph 18 around the capacity issues, I was quite struck that you seem to make a direct link between the board's inability to have a broad financial outlook at UHI Perth due to a lack of capacity in the college's finance team, and that these capacity issues were, quoting your own report, contributing to delays to starting work on the 24-25 budget. And you go on further to say that's been an issue since 2018. It was reported back in the 2018 audit that there were capacity issues. So this is 7 years now there have been capacity issues. And the knock-on effect of that is, well, look where we are today. Is that not a point of concern?
Yes, it is. I think it. So I think the regrettable factor is that concerns had been raised over a period of time about the importance of capacity to service effective financial management, support good governance, and that not being addressed. And that's accelerated in recent times, given the volume of turnover at senior finance levels that the convener mentioned earlier this morning. So it is a matter of concern. Whether it was, I'm sure none of the Board of Management nor principals anticipated that this would have resulted in a budget not being set and then subsequent consideration by this committee. But it's hard not to approach a conclusion that had they invested or been able to have some continuity and the right expertise at senior finance levels, that some of what's before the committee today could have been avoided.
We know what the deficit was that year. Do you know what the turnover of the business, I say business, but as the operation was over that same financial year? So we know that they were spending more than they had, but just to put it into context.
So the audited financial statements for 23-24, the college entity's income was just over 26 million.
and this is ground that's been covered already in terms of the who was asking questions of whom throughout this process. But it does strike me as particularly unusual that, given that the funding primarily would come via a third party, in this case the Funding Council, why they would have allowed sign-off of the release of funds to a body which had not presented financial accounts to them. That seems to me quite unusual. That's what's driven your report?
I think
is it the unusualness of this?
Yes, I think it's a slight technicality in language, Deputy Convener. I think that UHI Perth has prepared audited accounts and Deloitte have given an opinion, an unqualified, unmodified opinion on 23-24. That's really important, actually, and significant. So Deloitte, and far be it for me to speak to Deloitte's opinion, you'll cover that yourself. So there is financial reporting and governance captured that would have given some comfort. And we do mention, notwithstanding the errors in the 24-25 budget, that a budget has been prepared. There is progress also on the financial recovery plan that was agreed by the board of UHI Perth in August of this year and is now with the Scottish Funding Council and UHI for further consideration, going back to their request for liquidity support. So there are signs of progress, but much of that needs to be sustained. But again, Nicola, I'm sure will want to give further comment on that too.
Yes, I think probably I'd just comment that although the audit did commence late, it was an agreement with management that because of the capacity issues that we would delay the start of the audit. But actually the audit process itself in January and February went, all audits are challenging in different ways, but it went relatively well. We were able to conclude, given a clean financial opinion, and although we had some unadjusted and adjusted errors, there was nothing unusual, nothing high risk. We worked well together. But I think clearly, management had to focus on the audit at that time. There were issues around the budget and other things happening in the background. So again, it's just that point about prioritisation and, clearly the focus was on getting the audit complete, and that may have sort of moved focus away from some of the more routine internal reporting. And it just reflects a lack of, or a challenge around the capacity of the finance team to service all these different priorities.
Well, relatively small organisation in the grand scheme of things. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
okay. And thank you for clarifying the language that's being used there. I guess the point being is understanding the role that the SFC would play in all of this as a funding body, and their relationship with the board to have oversight and governance or lack of. You'll probably be aware of the session that we had with the Ethical Standards Commissioner. I'm sure you paid close attention to that. And this is an area that came up. There's much wider discussion around the quality and performance of board members across public sector bodies. It was intriguing that Mr Bruce said that, and made clear that it's not part of his role to look at board governance. So I guess my question is, whose role should it be?
It's clearly part of our work that we ask, or I ask, and the Accounts Commission ask auditors that we appoint to, and we set that out in annual audit reports each year on every public body about how well governance arrangements are working in those organisations. For the vast majority of public bodies, they're working well. So there is a consideration of governance, leadership, use of resources, and that will be captured in annual audit reports. So whilst audit absolutely has a role, the boards themselves and those who appoint board members also have a fundamental role about how well governance is being discharged. So whether that's in the college sector will apply to the regional strategic bodies where they are in place, and then the Scottish Funding Council will have an interest in it given the framework arrangements that exist. And then across wider parts of the public sector, which led to Mr Bruce's evidence, the report that we produced earlier this year on NHS governance as another example. But so I think from, whilst it's may not Mr Bruce's view, it's directly part of his remit, we're clear on what the respective boundaries are in terms of the audit role, but ultimately it is for the board, their sponsors, and who appoints the board to be satisfied that those governance arrangements are effective.
So in this case, then, wouldn't it be a primary function of the board to say to the organisation, have you prepared a budget for this financial year? And if the answer to that question is no, then what on earth are the board doing?
So that's regrettably the issue. We're not able to get any kind of sufficient clarity about why the board didn't raise a red flag to say that we cannot progress to supporting expenditure in the absence of a budget. The financial regulations are clear that a budget had to be prepared and approved by the Board of Management Deputy Convener, that this ought not to have reached the stage that it did. Regardless of the financial challenges, the imperative to prepare financial recovery plans and look at individual work streams is that the underpinning of a budget should have been in place.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Keith Brown to put some questions to you. Keith.
Thanks very much, Convener. I suppose that last point is of interest to me. I'm aware of some organisations, one in particular, which customarily receives lots of small donations, £10 or £15, but is not able to show receipts for that or individual accounts, and their accounts have, for that reason, been qualified. And yet here we have an organisation which has failed to set a budget, which, as you've just said, is a breach of the financial regulations, and yet got a clean bill of health from the auditor. How does that work?
There's two things. So, in the public audit model in Scotland, I ask auditors to provide an opinion on a set of financial statements, and Deloitte can speak to that. But we also ask to prepare an annual audit report. In the private sector, committee will be familiar, is that there's typically produced what's known as you'll see the independent auditor's report in a set of accounts, and that will set out what the auditor has done. Fundamentally, do the accounts give a true and fair view? And a set of accounts can give a true and fair view, but there could still be issues of governance within an organisation. So the annual audit report for UHI Perth draws attention to some of the wider issues, one being not setting a budget. So I'd say both those things can be true, but I'll certainly absolutely pass to Nicola to set out how she and her firm arrived at the clean audit opinion that they did.
So when you say a clean bill of health, what we did was we issued an unqualified audit opinion. So the audit opinion covers the financial statements themselves, so the entries for income, expenditure, balance sheet entries, and we test those. So we do a sampling methodology, we test them to evidence. As long as that evidence supports the accounting entries, we are able to give our opinion on the financial statements. So there were some adjustments, there were some things that we did some additional work around, but ultimately we were happy that materially the financial statements were accurate, so we gave a clean financial statements audit opinion. However, in the narrative wider scope work that Stephen's just referred to, where we look at the 4 domains, we did have a number of governance concerns. So if you read our sort of more detailed report that we presented to the board of the college, you will see that we comment on financial sustainability, we comment on some of these governance issues, we comment on the 2004-5. So I would not describe that as a clean bill of health. I would say within that element of the report, we raise a number of concerns for management to consider, and actually that is what led to Stephen's Section 22 report picking up on some of the sort of more significant elements of that and bringing those to your attention today. So there was a clean audit opinion, but I wouldn't describe it as a clean bill of health. I think we have concerns that we're raising.
Yeah, I think from a layperson's point of view, though, an unqualified opinion would give a level of reassurance which should be completely unjustified in this instance, given the fact they failed to set a budget, they failed to show why they hadn't set a budget, they weren't able to provide evidence as to any discussion as to why they hadn't set a budget. That's a breach of financial regulations. They were also making substantial errors in what they were doing. Just a layperson, it would be surprising to me in relation to that. Can I ask, though, so Deloitte were the auditors here for the college, but then were appointed as external auditors, or am I getting that wrong?
No, it's the same thing, so it's an overlap in terminology.
And it seemed from what you were saying earlier on that the internal audit function has kind of been denuded over the years, or its importance or the cognizance given to it by external auditors and perhaps the Auditor General has really, it's now diminished to being a kind of management tool. So it's not something that external auditors can rely on to give them real pointers as to the financial health and propriety of the organisation.
So in some ways that's a fair assessment, that internal audit remains a fundamental tool of management. and it always has been a tool of management to satisfy them that finances are in good order, the governance is in place and working effectively, and some of the activities and projects of an organisation are progressing as intended. And that has always been the case, and it remains so, that an internal audit service will produce a programme of work to report to management, to report to the board, to report to its audit committee. I think what has happened, again, and Nicola as a practitioner may want to say a bit more, is that there have been changes in auditing standards. That typically, if an internal auditor was undertaking a piece of work, an external auditor wouldn't. Avoiding duplication, which is a very reasonable set of activities. But the formality of that has changed. So an external auditor now will take a wider view about the presence of an internal auditor, consideration of their work, but not now saying that they won't undertake a particular audit test as part of the external audit because it has been covered. And that's been driven by changes in regulation. So the work of external auditors is overseen by auditing standards, accounting standards, the Financial Reporting Council. So auditors are careful to not to unnecessarily undertake duplicated work. But an external auditor has to do sufficient work themselves to give an opinion, to give that view on a set of financial statements.
I think it's important to remember that the objectives of external and internal audit are different. So internal audit are, as Stephen said, a tool of management. They're about process and control and the governance framework. An external audit, the product is the opinion on the financial statements. So we take account of internal audit work only insofar as it relates to those production of the financial statements. So some of their work will inevitably touch on some of the things that we do, but our opinion needs to stand alone. And what's happened with auditing standards is they've, over the years, clarified. So if I go back to the beginning of my career, sometimes you would, if internal audit had tested some payroll, you may test less because they'd done it. That doesn't happen anymore. Our work has to stand alone. So even if internal audit have done work, we will perform and document our own work to give ourselves that assurance over the financial statements. Although, as I've mentioned, if internal audit were to do some work and highlight there was a risk, so let's say there was a control they'd identified as failing, what we would do is think, do we need to modify our testing to ensure that the actual numbers in the financial statements are accurate? So we're less interested, I suppose, in the operation of the control, which internal audit are interested in. We're interested in how does that lead to the numbers in the financial statements, because that's what our opinion covers.
And only be involved in performing an audit role for the public bodies for which the Auditor General is responsible at the request of the Auditor General, or would they also do other work at the request of those bodies directly?
So there are very clear rules about independence. So as an external auditor, our primary objective is to remain independent, so we can't do work for those bodies if it might impinge upon our independence. And there are various factors to consider, such as if that work would contribute to the production of the accounts, we'd be auditing our own work, so we couldn't do that. So from time to time we can do additional work at organisations, but it tends to be something that we're quite careful and thoughtful about how we perform. And actually, if management were looking for additional governance type controls work, probably internal audit or a separate organisation would be the route that they would go down for support on improvement.
And just briefly to add to that, Mr Brown, so I appoint auditors for a 5-year term. So Deloitte will be appointed to conclude the 5-year cycle of audits of UHI, Perth and some other bodies that they do on behalf of myself and the Accounts Commission for the period up to 26-27 financial years. Thereafter, we've engaged with the Public Audit Committee. Audit Scotland's currently reviewing its planned audit approach to kind of what that might cover. So, and we'll be consulting formally on that in early 2026. On the point about additional services, these are very rare now, actually, and any request for a public body to have its external auditor, that either myself or the Accounts Commission point, has to be subject to additional approval by Audit Scotland. So there are next to no examples now of auditors in Scottish public sector undertaking any additional services that a public body might want. As Nicola quite rightly points out, There are many other avenues where they could receive that service, but for reasons of independence, it's become less and less appropriate for the external auditor to do anything other than the external audit.
Good thing. On the point that was being raised about the deficit budgets, and this is a bit of a subjective judgment I'm asking you to make, do you think it's possible that, and I wasn't aware of the extent to which this is used in the further education sector and the frequency with which it's used, but do you think there's a possibility that the culture might start to develop in such a way that if people are thinking to themselves, well, there's always that option of a deficit budget, so could that, as in this case, have been part of the reason why they got a bit more lax about even setting a budget at all?
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, actually. That if there is a suggestion that the body doesn't have to be solely responsible for its financial position, you know, that there's a regional strategic board that could support financial position, or the funding council might come in with liquidity support. I think, like you, I'm perhaps only speculating about some of the motivations, that there's a risk that that could then influence a perception that others will come to support the financial position, rather than real clarity, that is the board of management who's responsible for delivering the services, taking what inevitably would be difficult decisions, no question, and looking at kind of in terms of course provision, staff numbers, other income. So I think absolute clarity from the Funding Council and the regional strategic body about where they sit with deficit budgets will help organisations in the future, including UHI Perth, own their financial position.
It's a bit like a tightrope walker, knowing there's a safety net or if there's not a safety net, and the way that might impact on. Can you say anything more about the impact? Jamie Green mentioned, I think, 3 factors, but the other one I was interested in was the pensions estimates and the extent to which they're quoted as an influence. My experience is that the actuarial evidence or the actuarial guidance can oscillate quite hugely between one year and another, which can create huge problems for organisations. Is that the case here, or was it fairly minimal?
So I'll ask maybe Nicola or Mark might want to comment on what was called the adjusted operating position, but I would absolutely recognise the point you make that pensions and pension accounting can have an enormous impact on a public body's financial results, not just public sector, private sector too. They are very sensitive to small changes. You know, whether it's gilt rates, mortality assumptions, and that can result in pension funds. And we've seen these movements even in public sector pension schemes over the past few years, of where you've typically had deficits in some of the defined benefit pension schemes, that position swinging quite significantly when there's been changes, as I say, in interest rates or gilt rates into a surplus position. There are accounting rules about the recognition of surplus that public bodies are following. But I think it's a good thing that the college sector is focusing on the adjusted position, so that the impact of pensions isn't masking what's really the underlying position and the position that's to be managed. But again, Nicola, you might want to say more on that.
Yeah, I guess probably what I would say is, so there's a complex estimate that usually goes into a set of financial statements that's produced by an actuary and that we look at very carefully, but actually that is an accounting estimate, and actually the cash impact from a budgetary perspective is the contributions that are made, because that liability that's recognised is sort of a long-term future liability that will be paid in future by the pension fund. So actually, in terms of the issues identified here on the budget, the pension itself wasn't really a driver, although it is a complex estimate that does have an impact on the financial statements. I think from a budgetary cash flow perspective, it was less of an issue compared to the other areas we've talked about, such as staff costs and reduction of student numbers, etc.
Yeah, I think both in terms of pension estimates and the way they've varied and gone very high, very low, can have a major impact, can have an impact on jobs and all sorts of things. And the same is true, I think, in relation to the OBR or the Fiscal Commission. Their estimates are actually very important as to how budgets are set, and if they're wrong, as they, I think, absolutely invariably are, because they're constantly reviewed subsequently, then it should deserve more scrutiny, I would have thought. But on the issue about student numbers, which seems quite central to this and to the sector as a whole, looking at the the report that the auditor produced on Scotland's colleges. Is it possible, and it may be hard to say, you mentioned that Mr McPherson might have an insight into this, that the well-publicised reduction in overseas and other students for the higher education sector has meant that they have much more looked into the pool of people that will be going on to either further education or higher education in the further education sector, and that competition has meant that they are now struggling to get the numbers that they once were?
Yes, I think that's very possible, actually, so that the and Mark, you'll have more detail on this perhaps, but I think that has been attributed to some of the challenges that some of Scotland's further education colleges have experienced, that finding themselves in more competition for students, depending on some of the choices that higher education bodies are making. And you can see some of that borne out in some of the results of Perth College, whereby they weren't able to achieve some of the higher education assumptions that they had made, and then impacting on their financial position. So people or students exercising different choices, and then but producing a direct causal link between all of that is perhaps more challenging. But I think it's a very active assumption that people are exploring, Mr Brown, that as overseas student numbers fluctuate, Scotland's further education colleges are not immune to the implications for that. Mark?
Add to that is, of course, that's to not offer no specific view on whether it's a good or a bad thing, that students now have the option of being direct to university as opposed to what they did previously, which was perhaps use colleges a little bit of a stepping stone if they needed it before they went on to university. But yes, it's definitely an issue, as you referred to, Mr Brown, in our sector-wide report, which hopefully we'll discuss with the committee soon.
Yeah, I wasn't so much saying whether it was a good or a bad thing, but and this is my last question, Convener. I mean, looking at my own area where you've got Forth Valley College, this kind of potential dog-eat-dog approach where people are chasing student numbers, because that's the basis of much of the income of further and higher education institutions, even within a board area which has 3 different campuses, if the 2 larger campuses decide that they want to be the ones to get the lion's share of the numbers, it strikes me as odd that there seems to be a very substantial unmet demand. I would give the example of the Alba campus in Clackmannanshire, who have lots of students that want to come and yet can't afford because of the grant they get to fulfil those places. It just seems to me there's more of a general dog-eat-dog kind of approach as between the different institutions, and whether and I haven't completely finished reading the previous report you did as to whether you cover that or not, because that would have important implications and lessons and a direction for the sector more generally if that was the case. Are we pushing fewer students? What's the effect of the income that's been lost from overseas students in particular? And how do we get a more equitable distribution?
So I think it's a really, excuse me, my apologies, it's a very live issue. And you're seeing some of those financial challenges being borne out in some of Scotland's universities as well. So there is much evidence that's been given to the Education, Children and Young People's Committee by Scottish Funding Council. And I think it is a real decision point for the Funding Council about what support or view, and ultimately for ministers, I would suggest, about how all higher and further education operates in Scotland, the sustainability of the model that is provided. Because, excuse me again, I suspect that the competitive element at the moment is a relevant factor, and we're seeing some of that both in UHI Perth results, but across the piece. I should say, just for completeness, Convener, is that I don't audit higher education institutions in Scotland, though.
Yeah, I think just a comment to say that I certainly would find these kind of reports easier to understand if that larger context was available in part of them. So, for example, if Brexit had driven away lots of students from the EU that were otherwise coming, or a restriction on visas reduced the number of overseas students, seeing that kind of context, rather than just always saying this is a challenge for the sector or ministers to see what the overall context is. But that's just one of my foibles. That's enough for me. Thanks, Kafina.
Okay, thank you, Keith. And as we've mentioned a few times this morning, an important report was produced last week on the funding position of further education, and we will be having an evidence session on that broader palette. And of course, Mr Brown is very welcome to join us, either as the substitute member of the committee or as somebody who's got a very particular interest in his own constituency. But can I just finish on the particularity of Perth College and reflect that the departing finance director, Gavin Stevenson, gave an interview to the Courier newspaper in which he said that the financial position was perilous at the college, that it was desperately precarious, and he even spoke about the nuclear option might have to be considered, by which I think he meant closure of all, presumably, or part of the service, the education service currently provided by the college. Do you have any reflections on that perspective?
So I won't use the language of Mr Stevenson, convener, but I would recognise that some of the financial challenges to be overcome are significant. And the provision of financial support by UHI and SFC is clearly a factor in helping them transition to a more stable place. It's equally important that the governance and oversight of that is managed properly, both within the Board of Management themselves, that the budget process is integrated, and that the work of the committee and the external contributions by UHI, all of that is operating effectively. Through our own direct work, through the work of Deloitte as the appointed auditors, we will seriously consider, as we do every year, financial sustainability of this organisation, and we'll keep a close eye on that and consider further public reporting on the back of the 24-25 audit.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And we've come to the end of our time on this report this morning. So can I take this opportunity to thank you, Mark McPherson, Nicola Wright and Auditor General for presenting your evidence, and we as a committee will need to consider what our next steps are. We're about to keep two of you but lose Ms Wright as we change over witnesses. So to allow us to change over witnesses, I am now going to suspend this morning's meeting. Well, can I welcome everyone back to a resumption of the Public Audit Committee. We are now turning to agenda item 3, which is a consideration of a report which Audit Scotland has produced on its impact monitoring and evaluation report. We're joined in this section of the committee's agenda by, again, the Auditor General Stephen Boyle, and alongside Mr Boyle is Mark McPherson. We are welcome back, Mr McPherson. But we're also joined in this part of the committee's work by Michelle Borland, who is the Head of Organisational Improvement at Audit Scotland. So we've got one or two questions to put to you, but before we get to those, Auditor General, could I invite you to make an opening statement?
Thanks again, Convener. I'm very pleased to present to the committee our annual impact monitoring and evaluation report, which we published in September of this year, based on work related to May of 2025. Convener, the report includes data covering both our performance audits and our annual audit work, and it also includes follow-up work on annual audits in the financial year ending the 31st of March 2024, together with performance audits published between July 2022 and February of 2024, many of which will have been considered by this committee. For the communication monitoring part of the report, we looked at reports that were published more recently, between February 24 and December of last year. Convener, we think we have good evidence that public bodies are accepting our recommendations, which are the primary vehicle with which we look to support assurance and improvement, and that they're responding positively to them and taking steps to implement our recommendations. However, there is also evidence that the pace of implementation of some audit recommendations is slow. Our performance audit teams assessed that over half of recommendations in scope for this audit impact report as either work in progress, and regrettably only 6% have been fully implemented. Recommendations about financial sustainability and the use of resources to improve outcomes have the lowest rates of implementation. Annual reports on the college sector and the NHS that I've produced have shone light on fiscal sustainability issues and the need to accelerate progress on transformation and reform, and we'll continue to follow up those, both in recent college report and the upcoming NHS annual report later this year. The annual audit recommendations are being implemented more quickly. They focus on a single body rather than sector-wide, which in some ways it makes it more straightforward to implement an audit recommendation rather than having the need for collaboration across multiple public bodies. 56% of the 2022-23 audit recommendations have been implemented, and a further 33% were in progress. We aim to be proportionate when evaluating impact. We're interested in a broad understanding of what is changing in public services due to our audit work, and this is more than just about the number of audit recommendations that have or haven't been implemented. Monitoring and evaluating our work is important, as it helps us understand whether we are making a difference that's expected of us by the Parliament. It also helps identify improvements to our audit approach and increase our impact in the years to come. Later this year, we will publish our first evaluation report on how well we're delivering against the outcomes that the Audit Scotland Board, the Accounts Commission and I agreed as part of Public Audit in Scotland, covering the period 2023 to 28. Following up audit recommendations, lastly, is a critical part of understanding our impact. We recognise that there are boundaries to this work, with public bodies being responsible for implementing audit recommendations as they choose to do so. I think, as we've discussed in recent times with the committee, we cannot compel a public body to implement a recommendation that they've previously accepted. But we also aim to do this to support continuous improvement and to better understand the pace of progress and change in public services, as ever, to support parliamentary scrutiny. And, Convener, between Mark, Michelle and myself, we look forward to answering the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. You mentioned the importance of monitoring and evaluation in making a difference. Could you explain how the monitoring and evaluation framework makes a difference?
Yeah, very happy to do that. Actually, I think I might pass straight to Michelle for this one, just to kind of set out some of the wider approaches that we have. And then I'm happy to come back in with Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, thanks for the question about the auditing or the impact framework. We share that framework in the report in Exhibit 1, and I think I would explain that we take a three-pronged approach to monitoring and evaluating our impact within public audit. So we're looking at kind of monitoring early impact so we can get an understanding of the visibility of our work and the initial traction that it's getting. And then we look at evaluating the early impact within the first kind of 18 months, 12 to 18 months of the report being produced, to look at what's happening with our recommendations, how our work is influencing change, where we're seeing change in public bodies as a result of recommendations we've made, and what stakeholder feedback's telling us about the quality of our work and the way that it's landing with stakeholders. And then the third kind of tier of our impact, which is a really critical aspect of it, is thinking then about how that change is impacting on the outcomes that we set within public audit in Scotland. So this report that you've got in front of you today looks at the first two layers of that framework, the early impact we're having through our social media and communications engagement, and then the kind of early impact we're having through our recommendations and the change that's happening in a result. Later on this year, we're looking forward to publishing a further report about how that impact is influencing the outcomes in public audit in Scotland and the contribution to those outcomes.
Mr Brown is going to ask some questions about social media and media in general and so on. But before we get to those, I'm going to invite the Deputy Convener to put a couple of questions to you.
Thank you. Can I, first of all, thank you for your report. I can see that you've sent somebody on a course on how to do lots of bar charts and pie charts. However, they weren't all obviously clear to me, I have to say, in terms of how you report data. So let's just go to the beginning of your report, the high-level Exhibit 6, and correct me if I'm wrong, but over the years 22, 23, 24, the data set that you're using to produce this audit covers 11 performance audits across those years, which made 63 recommendations, and 235 annual audits, which made a total of 949 recommendations across the 2 years. Is that correct?
So you're correct, but so for those in scope for this report, there was 11 performance audits, but it's not. For the annual audits, it's not maybe quite correct to add those two numbers together, because effectively that's just the number of public bodies that we audited in that year. So in 1 year and then the following year, you'll see that there's a difference from 115 to 118.
Yeah.
The number of public bodies changes at the margins each year, depending on whether new bodies have been created. Some the committee's cited on some of those, but that's broadly reflective of what's within the scope of what we're evaluating this year. If I may, Deputy Convener, we're very happy. I'm very grateful for any feedback the committee has on this report. We try and recognise that there's a range of different audience and accessibility, and look to, where appropriate, bring in tabular or graphical formats to convey information. We're, as I say, grateful for any views that the committee has on how effective that is.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to get my head around is the bigger picture. You do go into quite granular detail on the different types of recommendations and what various stages they're at, if you can work out what's the dark blue and the light blue. But once you've got over that, I guess the point I'm trying to get my head around is let's just take 1 year then. Let's take the 23-24 year, because that has the higher amount of public bodies that you've done an annual audit of, and the 459 recommendations that have come out of all those reports. And what I just simply wondered was a sort of top line is, of those 459, how many in your view to date were fully implemented, in progress, or had not been touched at all? And I couldn't actually find that information in any of these bar charts. Unless it's there, and please point me to it.
Yeah, so I'll pass to Michelle, actually, just to kind of set that very precisely for the committee, because I think it is captured in the report, and they're structured around really 5 main headlines that is drawn directly from the Code of Audit Practice, which frames how an external audit of a public body in Scotland is undertaken. So you will see recommendations on the financial statements. So is there anything directly that an external auditor has identified that will suggest to support improvement in a public body. And then it goes into what we refer to as the wider scope of public audit in Scotland, recommendations on financial management, financial sustainability, use of resources, governance and leadership factors. So those are the headlines. So I think, broadly speaking, sometimes a public body will receive no recommendations from an auditor that there is nothing that they would suggest to bring to their attention. And in other cases, there could be a double-digit number of recommendations. So it's averaging, give or take, around 4 recommendations per public body. But perhaps it's a bit too crude to say that that's kind of reflective across the piece. But again, Michelle can set out, I think, just building on the opening remarks I made about how many have or haven't been implemented.
Yeah, I can appreciate, Mr. Green, why that's confusing. And I think the reason it's important to be clear about which audits are in which scope for different aspects of the report. So the annual audits in scope for 22-23, that's where we're able to assess the implementation progress that's been made against those recommendations, because that assessment's undertaken during the 23-24 audit. For the 2023-24 audit, we haven't yet undertaken all the follow-up associated with that, because that gets done during the 24-25 audit. So that's why you wouldn't be able to find that information in the report. So for 23-24 audits in scope, we're reporting on whether the recommendations have been accepted. For the 2022-23 audits and report, that's where we're reporting on the implementation status. In next year's report, we'll be able to report on the progress made with the recommendations we made in 23-24, because that gets followed up in 24-25. I appreciate there's a lot of financial years in there, but that's why there's kind of a period of follow-up that happens over a course of a number of years.
Yeah, I guess what I'd be looking for is, as a member of public audit, is trends and patterns. So if you look at the recommendations, which is broadly this similar amount of both bodies and recommendations, incidentally, but is there a pattern of fewer or more being implemented in the early stage, in the long term, or just completely ignored? Because we make a big deal of the 93% figure. Public bodies sit in front of where you're sitting and say, yes, I accept the recommendations of the report. But those are just words. It's how many of those actually translate into. So we have a bigger remit. You have no statutory duty to follow up on these recommendations or any locus in that respect, but we do. So that's the sort of data I need to see where that direction of travel is going.
I absolutely recognise that, and I think Michelle can combine. I think Mark might want to say a word or two about this as well. So no, we have no statutory duty, and I think I've said a number of times in recent weeks to the committee. It is for public bodies to either accept or reject an audit recommendation, and for them to follow up upon that. And absolutely valuing the role that the Public Audit Committee does in exploring whether a recommendation has or hasn't been accepted or implemented. We think we've got a locus in that too, about exploring through follow-up work, both on an annual audit basis and also through our programme of follow-up of performance audits, to some extent capturing in today's report whether this has or hasn't made a difference of the original audit recommendation. As we similarly refer to in the report, Deputy Convener, we keep our methodology under review about the vehicles with which we are using to explore follow-up and progress and audit impact, and we make reference to some kind of further thinking we'll do following, as Michelle mentioned, the evaluation of public audit in Scotland later this year. But I'll bring Michelle in to say more on this point first of all.
Thank you. I'll just come back on the point about trends, because that's something that we're really interested in as well. So obviously, as Stephen mentioned, this approach is evolving and we're continuously improving it. We just undertook kind of implementing the framework within our annual audit teams with annual audit work in 2022-23. So we don't have trend data yet. So we will have that next year. We've been working with this impact framework within performance audit for a little bit longer, so that's why you can see some trend data on performance audit in this report. We have more years worth of data for performance audit where we've done this impact work. So through this year's audit work at 24-25, we'll be looking at the progress with recommendations made in the 23-23 audit. So next year, in next year's report, we'll be able to provide better trend data to the committee on that.
That's helpful, thank you. Can I point to paragraph 36, and maybe you can clarify what you mean by this. And this is particularly on performance audits. You state, we do not currently have systems in place to follow up recommendations made in national reports to all local authorities or multiple bodies. The word follow-up is a bit vague. What do you mean by that?
Effectively, what we mean was the recommendation implemented. So it's a process that we go through to explore evidence, referring back to the original recommendation. Was it accepted? Was it implemented? And what difference has it made? So that's what me going back a certain period of time after the original report to see whether it was effective, implemented or not. So we can actually, maybe Mark, we want to say this, Mark leads our programme of performance audit development, actually can say where we've got to in some of our additional thinking.
I think it's just it's a resource challenge, obviously, to go back and check progress in every public body in Scotland on a range of different reports. So we are trying to find the right balance between how do we get that information, and we talk a little bit about the fact that we now engage more readily with audited bodies after the publication of the report to determine when they are going to make their implement recommendations, whether they are not able to implement the recommendation for whatever reason. But that it definitely requires a lot more thought to get that for multiple bodies. When it's like a single body audit, relatively straightforward. When it's one where most of the recommendations are to an individual body or to a small number of bodies. For colleges, that's Scottish Government, Scottish Funding Council, maybe the college sector as a whole, we can do it. But there is, I think we've always had an approach to assessing progress with recommendations, but in the last couple of years we've tried to make that more systematic and more consistent, but we recognise that we've still work to do to capture information where it relates to many bodies across the whole of the public sector.
I would say also is that it has made us quite thoughtful about making recommendations to multiple bodies. I think a topic we've explored with the committee in previous discussions on this report, and hopefully one that you'll have seen through perhaps our reporting over the past 18 months has moved away from having almost a catch-all report to a recommendation to a particular sector in a performance audit. Has been more precise about a smart recommendation for the reasons that Mark outlines, giving effective follow-up and evidence across multiple bodies would be extremely time-consuming and laborious. So almost is there an upstream alternative to that, but the recommendations focusing on a particular organisation rather than multiple ones. Some cases we will still do so. You'll see future reporting we'll do on the NHS will likely still make recommendations to NHS boards because as a homogenous group that makes sense, but it's something we're quite thoughtful and only deploying where it really is appropriate to do so.
Do you think that Audit's got to give enough cognisance to some of the factors that maybe explain why public bodies or the audited bodies have been unable to implement recommendations? So there are a number of external factors. So you talk a lot about financial sustainability in a huge chunk of your recommendations. You talk about issues around workforce issues, but also there's a wider regulatory and legislative environment that these bodies are working in, which is outside of their control as well. Do you think your focus is too much on the you did or didn't deliver on those recommendations, even if they wanted to, then perhaps they couldn't?
No. I recognise the complexity, first of all. So many of our reports will go into challenging territory, whether it's on fiscal sustainability, workforce reform, wider public service reform, rather than being issue specific. And I think our view is that still feels the right area in terms of the contribution that public audit can make to support assurance over public spending, public service delivery, and the heart of today's report about making well-considered, effective recommendations that support improvement. I may bring colleagues on in a moment because I think there are a couple of case studies in the report actually that perhaps illustrate the point about accepting more challenging recommendations that can have an impact. And it's one on we did a report on courts backlog, the criminal courts backlog, and no question a challenging recommendation about the needs for a wider consideration of reform that just really in the last few weeks, some of those recommendations have been gone through public consultation and ultimately through legislation considered by the Parliament around digital evidence taking and so forth. So I think that probably means that there might be a timescale, a complexity issue, or indeed that some of our recommendations, whilst accepted, won't always be implemented in timescale because they might be complicated and will require consultation, engagement, more than one body contributing to those. But just to reassure you, Deputy Convener, we absolutely understand the complexity and the challenging circumstances that public bodies are in when making these recommendations.
Thanks, Stephen. I maybe will leave Mark to come in on the court's backlog recommendation and audit work in particular and the impact that that's had, and just comment on, I think it's really important that we reflect on the barriers to implementation for public bodies and recognise where it's challenging and where progress isn't being made, why that is, because I think it can help us as an organisation understand how to make recommendations better and more impactful. So Stephen mentioned smart recommendations. It's so important that our recommendations are realistic and achievable for public bodies to implement. So the more we reflect on the barriers and challenges, the more we can craft recommendations that are meaningful and actually they can be delivered by public bodies. And part of the guidance that we've developed for auditors, since developing this work and looking at how we can improve, has been where we're making recommendations, we're consulting with public bodies on what those recommendations look like as a result of the evidence we're finding through the audit, and giving them an opportunity to comment on those so that we can make sure we're shaping them in a way that's realistic and achievable and will add value and impact to what they're doing, and also that we have a sense of how long it might take them to make progress on these, and we can put timescales in our reports and have a better sense of what the pace actually is in terms of their ability to implement recommendations. So I think that's really key and part of what auditors will reflect on post-publication when we look at pace of implementation. Those barriers are something that, Stephen mentioned, capacity, workforce shortages, financial pressures, all of those things we would take into account when we're crafting the recommendations and making sure they're realistic.
Questions, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring in Keith Brown.
Thanks very much. Just looking, it's only a couple of questions in a particular area, but looking at the data you provided in relation to almost the sort of validation you might get from media reach, I think that's maybe the way to describe it. Do you see dangers in that? And as far as, some people say it's a formulaic approach whereby reports are produced which are relatively, straightforward and discussing pros and cons and so on, but end up with a kind of soundbite quote at the end, which, if you publish it on the right day, are guaranteed to get more parliamentary impressions, more media coverage. Is there a danger here in chasing headlines and the preponderance of negative stories? The media will always want to see those more than positive ones. Is there a danger in looking in that area for validation?
So it's a real point to be really careful and look to be considered on, that we get that balance right, that there's a reach, not just media, but to the public and also to the Parliament. We look to, on our reports, to make them accessible, firstly across the Parliament, always initially through this committee, but then also we do give evidence to subject committees too, whether it's on our finance reports, and then particularly the committee's awareness. The recent report we produced on adult disability payment, likely to be of interest to the Social Justice Committee. So the Parliament will always be our primary audience for our work, but recognising also that there is an interest through public bodies and the public about how public services are performing, and to do that in a really considered and balanced way. And that's informed right upstream from the work that we set out in the programme of work that we consult on. So I consult with this committee, and the committee decides thereafter to go beyond the rest of the Parliament. Is the proposed topics that myself and the Accounts Commission are planning to audit, are those the right ones, or is there other areas that we should be thinking about? And look to capture that in the reporting and that comes from the audits. There'll always be a next on what happens next. And I think that's really what feels like the more important bit, is did the audit recommendations, did they make a difference? And doing that in a balanced way. I would just the last point to address Mr Brown is that when we produce a report that validates how public service are performing, it doesn't always get the traction that a report that is more critical in tone. And I think even, I think I've referenced it before, Deputy Convener, is that I think you challenged me on the day I presented the report on Scottish National Investment Bank about this feeling, a more positive tone, and it was. There's a report that said that a public body, and I'm paraphrasing, had largely done what it was set out to do, and that was characterised in the audit of the Scottish National Investment Bank. But underpinning all of this is that our reports are the evidence-based, and we've got the quality framework, as a robust process following auditing standards. We are we're subject to review by Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales currently provides that service, so they are reviewing our work, going through our files. Did we have the evidence to support the conclusions and judgments that we make publicly, and most importantly to the Parliament?
I think it's just that I remember 20 odd years ago the Audit Scotland did a report, Best Value Report on Local Authorities, and the council of which I was leader, Clackmannanshire, came top. Never had any comment from it apart from Clackmannanshire Council and myself. We shouted about it for years afterwards, I remember. But that kind of positive stuff, not just for its own value or how it might make other people feel good, it's really important to know what's been done right and what can be used as an example for others to improve. And I think sometimes the lack of context. So, for example, if there's an area of public life in Scotland that's been looked at, and if there's no comparison with how it's happening in England and Wales, better or worse, those are the kind of things that are meaningful to people because there's a relatively similar financial environment in all three areas. Or if, for example, Brexit's impacting an area. But what we get instead is things like underfunding, which is a loaded term. It's a value judgment. Surely there must be a case for saying that there are times when if something's been done well, we should broadcast it. And if something's been done badly, especially in relation to other parts of the UK where it's been done better, even given a similar environment, that would be meaningful information to the public. And I come back to the public because by talking about your social media reach and your PR, if you like, you're recognising that the public, maybe expressed through the Parliament, are interested and have an interest here. But by and large, beyond the headlines which it generates, how much does it register with the public, I suppose, if you can make sense of that?
And understanding the reach beyond the Parliament is challenging. I think you'll see in the report that we used to use a proxy of downloads from our website as an indication of engagement, but with changes of technology and bots in place in AI, it's now become a bit redundant as an understanding of reach. On the point about good news stories, so I think we're at a good point actually. So we're considering the next cycle of the work that we'll ask both Audit Scotland. When I say we, I'm talking about the Accounts Commission myself. The work that we'll ask auditors to do. The Accounts Commission, you'll know this well from your local authority background, currently have a cyclical approach. So they'll produce what's known as a best value assurance report on every single local authority over the course of a 5-year period. I do a slightly different approach, so I'm producing perhaps more sectoral reports, the college one that you referenced earlier, and similar with the NHS. The work programme, I think, is the real driver for this. And we're looking to select audit topics that some might be challenging, some get a sense of, or some that are new. And I think it's that balance and the SNIB one's a good example. So I had no preconceptions about what that might produce when we started the audit. But to see a validation of this, a vital and a significant funding element of public service, how that was performing. And other times we'll produce a report that perhaps has more recommendations for improvement. We're always cognizant of the fiscal challenges, and we hope that our audit work, rather than just to draw attention to it in isolation, but actually is to make recommendations about how some of the fiscal challenges might be addressed the importance of public service reform. And I think we were pleased on that last point to see the development of clearer strategies and plans around public service reform, the annual medium-term financial strategy, which had much of a tale about, the audit had been making recommendations about the importance of medium-term financial planning for many years, and now to see that integrated into the calendar of government scrutiny and approaches feels like just a couple examples of audit impact. But hopefully to reassure you, Mr. Wren, we're always aware of the importance of balance and clarity with which is evidence-based in how we report our work.
My last point is a question then. I mean, you've mentioned SNIB and delighted to hear it had cabinet responsibility for establishing it in the first place. But could you, off the top of your head, mention one or maybe two other examples where you have found good practice or excellent work which have actually generated any kind of media response to it?
Crossing is a high profile.
Another one for which I was responsible, but thank you for that. Yeah,
I'm ticking all the boxes here, and hopefully I mentioned. I don't wish to repeat it, but the public service reform strategy, together with fiscal sustainability delivery plan, medium-term financial strategy, I think these are important evidence of impact. One last one, if you'll permit me, through our audit of the Scottish Government, we've drawn attention, I think, a number of times to how the National Performance Framework and the national outcomes were working. So these clear ambitions, but through our audit of them, saying that they weren't underpinned by good evidence or metrics. So that the Deputy First Minister signalled a pause on that and a stop to it. We think that's a good thing. That's a good evidence of impact to get clearer outcomes that can support how well public services are performing and public money is being spent.
Thanks. Graham Simpson's indicated he doesn't have any questions. Colin Beattie, do you have any questions?
I'm conscious of time, Convener. Just a couple of quick ones. Exhibit 11 shows the progress in the implementation of the recommendations from the 115 audit reports, 490 recommendations in total, but the status of 10 recommendations is unknown. Why is that?
Thank you.
Okay. So that's related to the way that we pull the data through from the annual audit reports. So obviously there's a lot of annual audit reports in scope. The data for this report comes from an assessment of recommendations at the back of the report. And this is an area for improvement that we've identified in the report. Sometimes the assessment that we've made isn't drawing a clear conclusion about progress with the recommendation. So we've not been able to kind of identify exactly what progress has been made and classify it in one of these sort of not implemented, work in progress, implemented or superseded categories. So one of the things that we've identified in the next steps section of the report is to improve the consistency with which we're assessing progress against recommendations within the annual audit so that we can not have 10 of those recommendations where the status is unknown.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So on that note, I will draw this session to a close, and can I thank Michelle Ball and Mark McPherson and Stephen Boyle, Auditor General, for your evidence on that report. And it's a theme that we will return to, and I'm sure will be part of our deliberations as a committee when considering our legacy report for the next session of Parliament. So I will now, as agreed earlier on by the committee, move us into private session.